Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation on The Future Looks Bright Toward a Dialectical Understanding of the Future. My name is Lorenzo Skade, and I'm from the European University Viadrina. This paper is motivated by the fact that there are many initiatives out there, such, for example, Fridays for Future, or the current pandemic, which have shown that we struggle to understand what the future is and where we will be in the future. Furthermore, what goes hand in hand with this is the question whether the future is out there and can be grasped, or is the future actively constructed by actors. So this study is motivated by the fact that we still do not know much about how actors could proactively construct different categories of the future through their daily activities. Looking at the literature, we know that there is a continuing interest in understanding issues of time and temporality. However, research on the category of the future is still rare. So there are some initial works who have started to address this issue. And at the same time, there's also a call for taking the notion of uncertainty more seriously again in management and organization literature. Future in this case can be defined as alternative states and possible outcomes that could occur but have not yet occurred, which points in a direction that the future has to be actualized through activities of actors. And therefore, I argue that understanding the future is important for a lot of topics, for example, strategy making, but also for leadership and creating visions for followers, and also in entrepreneurship with regard to creating creative ideas in the future. And in order to provide an alternative lens on studying the future, I suggest a dialectical understanding. What is a dialectical understanding? Well, dialectics are interdependent opposites aligned with forces that push-pull on each other like a rubber band and exist in an ongoing dynamic interplay as the poles implicate each other. So this definition highlights the notion that there might be two different poles, but is also very much interested in the dynamic interplay. And this interplay is constituted through processes and practices which it addresses. So, so far, a dialectical understanding has been mobilized in organization studies, for example, in order to address organizational phenomena such as strategic planning or institutional change or resistance. So in this paper, I argue that the process of unfolding of the future could be explored by a dialectical understanding that directs attention away from predictability and uncertainty and tries to render a more integral concept of the future, and exploring what are underlying tensions in the literature and what is a possible alternative approach that we can have at this. So I summarize this understanding in a model, and the basic pillars of the model are the notions of predictability and uncertainty. And I argue that most of the categories of the future are organized according to this tension, and a dialectical perspective then focuses not so much on the either or tension of either predictability or uncertainty, but is more interested in intersections, commonalities, and a more than understanding. So the first category that I highlight are the categories of near versus distant future, the category of availability. Here I argue that near futures are near and more available constructs versus distant futures are future states that are almost fictional. And in order to make sense of this, a more than approach, which kind of highlights how near and distant futures are interconnected, could help us to further grasp this concept. A second category which I highlight is continuous versus disruptive, the notion of flow. If you, for example, see the future as continuously unfolding, it's easier to predict it because it's just a repetition of events that happened in the past. In turn, if actors perceive that the future is only disruptive, they find that the future has nothing to do with the present and, so to say, interrupts the present state. I argue in turn that understanding how these two hold together and how the future can be both continuous and disruptive could help us to highlight which part of the past are continuing and which are probably not. The next category is the category of past versus present, which I've labeled dependence. So some argue that the future is depending on the past and on history, such as also past futures. And they have argued that it's more important to understand what has been in the past, whereas others have argued that the present is more interesting in order to study the future, to see what has not transpired yet, what is not being experienced and what is still open for interpretation. And I argue that this interplay between past and present futures could help us also maybe to grasp more the notion of future futures and in turn help actors to remain open to the interplay of these tensions. Lastly, the tension between realized and imagined futures, and the categories of materialization of the future. Here I argue that realized future are futures that have already been actualized, versus imagined futures are the ones that are only mental representation of the future states to come. A dialectical perspective could help us to explain how some of the imagined futures fold into realized futures and why others not possibly. So taken together, I argue that this dialectical understanding pretty much highlights the dynamic interplay, and it's interesting how these two poles are held together and are unfolded and are unfolding. And therefore, I argue that it's important to understand future-making practices which constitute this interplay. So several studies have already started to propose future-making practices which are based on a practice-based understanding. And such practices want to examine mundane and everyday activities of or constructing and enacting futures. Therefore, I suggest to engage with the literature to further expand on these practices. And some of these, which are already in line, are imagining, anticipating, and processing. Imagining here is linked to the notion of creativity and builds upon the practice of actors who use their imagination in order to create images of possible futures. Anticipating in turn means foreseeing, foreshadowing, or forecasting of future events. This means that this practice is also performative, as actors already start to get engaged with the possible future state. For example, startup founders who anticipate their futures in pitches through talks and bodily enactment. And lastly, processing refers to creating out of these imagines and processing them in order to construct futures. So, for example, the use of strategic instruments can help actors to process their futures they have imagined. Also, this practice entails the notion that actors need to coordinate different images of the futures which come together and distinguish which one to actualize while not suppressing others at the same time. So, concluding this presentation, I argue that a dialectical understanding of the future is a perspective that embraces both predictability as well as uncertainty. I argue that this perspective offers us a way to talk about processes and practices in between the poles of the interplay of different categories of the future. Furthermore, I argue that this has important implications for future-making practices, which are important in order to understand the mundane and daily activities of actors in order to engage with future making, in order to enacting and constructing futures. Furthermore, I argue this perspective will allow us to understand how also different futures at the same time can come together and exist in plural in just one organization. Additionally, I highlight that there are also some avenues for future research which could be interested in this idea, namely the literatures on grand challenges and utopias. Both of this literature draw heavily on the notion of the future and are interested in ways in which the future emerges, unfolds, becomes materialized, and also fades away. And therefore, I argue that also these streams of literature can profit from such an understanding. So thank you very much for your attention. I look very forward to hearing your feedback on this paper proposal. Please feel free to discuss your feedback during our session, during the EGOS colloquium, or please feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter. Thank you very much.